that they shoveled to groups because Trump was coming and then they were going to reverse all this stuff. And the supposedly environmental groups, and they were not really environmental groups, and they had no experience in doing it. Like I said before, I care about the plastics. Do I think this money was going to get rid of the plastics in my brain? I do not. So I am skeptical of the Department of Education, and I think every Democrat who runs really needs to take on this issue, because that's your portfolio, education.
Did you catch that awkward showdown between Bill Maher and Governor Josh Shapiro about the Department of Education? Is this massive federal agency actually helping our kids? Or is it just a bloated bureaucracy wasting taxpayer dollars? Today, we're diving deep into why even a liberal like Bill Maher seems to be questioning its existence, and why as a conservative Republican, I'm wholeheartedly agreeing with him while scratching my head at Shapiro's predictable political maneuvering.
You need to put that ring on, or whatever it was.
What does the panel think of the Trump administration gutting and potentially eliminating the Department of Education? I'm still thinking about it, honestly.
Hey, you take this one.
Here's what I care about. I got kids with special needs. I've got kids who are coming from poor families who rely on this funding from the federal government to have a shot in life. I said before, I want every child of God to have the freedom to chart their own course, the opportunity to succeed. The federal government made a compact with those kids.
After seeing the recent exchange between the outspoken Bill Maher and Pennsylvania Governor Josh Shapiro, I've got a whole pot brewing on this one. Now, for those who missed it, Bill Maher, a guy who often surprises folks with his common sense despite his liberal leanings, had a pretty pointed conversation with Governor Shapiro about the Department of Education. And frankly, watching it, I found myself nodding along with Maher more than I ever thought I would, with a comedian who usually targets my side of the aisle.
I hope they don't break that compact with those kids.
I guess what the question, though, really is the Department of Education doing that? Is it now? They probably are doing some good work. I'm sure they are. What is their budget? Like $200 billion or something? But it also looks like some of these places are just funneling money to people who are not solving the problem. I mean, I saw that story about the $20 billion that went out the door after Biden lost the EPA. It wasn't the EPA, or was it the EPA? But so there was $20 billion that they shoveled to groups because Trump was coming and then they were going to reverse all this stuff. And the supposedly environmental groups, and they were not really environmental groups, and they had no experience in doing it. Like I said before, I care about the plastics. Do I think this money was going to get rid of the plastics in my brain? I do not. So I am skeptical of the Department of Education, and I think every Democrat who runs really needs to take on this issue, because that's your portfolio, education.
Let's be clear. As a conservative Republican, the idea of a massive centralized Department of Education in Washington has always rubbed me the wrong way. We believe in local control, in empowering parents and communities to shape the education of their children, not some bureaucracy thousands of miles away. And it seems Bill Maher is tapping into that same sentiment, questioning the effectiveness and the sheer size of this behemoth.
And the results aren't good.
Well,
Kids isn't.
The education standards.
Kids isn't learning.
Kids are not.
Kids isn't learning.
I think through all this, I'm sorry, Sam.
I will say it's clear that our education achievements are not where they need to be, right? Like, we look at any comparison to any other country, we're just not keeping up. The question is, absent that funding, would it be worse, right? We don't know. This money, if it can get funneled back into the states, I'm assuming there are some Democrats who say, good, keep the top lines at where they are and we can use it to our benefits. But this money was also used to set education standards, to study how to do better curriculums, to figure out how to recruit teachers in a comprehensive, thorough way. And so I don't know every program that they are cutting right now, but the idea that there won't be any adverse consequences seems not logical.
Of course not, because that's what they do. They blow everything up first. That's what I don't get about this.
What really struck me was the stark contrast between Maher's genuine skepticism and Shapiro's, well, let's just call it the typical politician dance. When Maher raised the possibility of the Trump administration potentially gutting or even eliminating the Department of Education, you could see the discomfort on Shapiro's face. Instead of engaging with the core question of whether this department is truly serving our kids, what did we get? The predictable talking points about protecting funding for children with special needs and those from poor families. Now, don't get me wrong, nobody on this show, and certainly no conservative I know, wants to see vulnerable children suffer. That's a blatant misdirection. The real question, the one Maher was hinting at, is whether the current system, with its massive budget, is actually the best way to support these kids. Are we seeing the outcomes that justify this enormous expenditure and top-down control? From my perspective, and I think many of you watching feel the same way, the answer is a resounding no. We've seen decades of increased federal involvement in education, and yet when you look at it, international comparisons, as someone in the clip rightly pointed out, the United States isn't exactly topping the charts. We're pouring billions into this system. And what are we getting in return? Too often, it feels like we're funding a bloated bureaucracy more than we're actually educating our children.
I think it's important that we support the American people, not the American institutions. You are right that there is waste, there is fraud, there is abuse in these institutions. It should be rooted out. It's one of the reasons why when I was a county executive of Pennsylvania's third largest county, we did zero-based budgeting. We didn't go in with a hatchet. We literally went in and said, your budget's zero. Build it up to where it needs to be. And you know what happened? Some agencies were reduced. Some agencies got a lot more because it was mission driven. I think we've got to focus on meeting the mission, meeting the goals, and then driving the funding out to meet those goals.
Is the Democratic Party too much in the pocket of the teachers union?
No, I think the Democratic Party cares deeply about making sure these children get a shot in life. I certainly care about that. And I'm not suggesting that everything the Department of Education does is wise.
I'm talking about unions now, the teachers union, because I think like during COVID, didn't the teachers union keep the schools closed way too long?
Look, we partnered with our teachers unions in Pennsylvania to increase the number of teachers we have in the classrooms, to reduce class sizes, and to improve outcomes for kids. I think there's ways to work with the teachers unions to make progress for our children.
And let's talk about this money. The clip mentions the idea of funds being shoveled to groups with questionable experience. While the example given was about environmental groups, it raises a valid point about government spending in general. How much of the Department of Education's budget is actually making its way to the classroom? And how much is being siphoned off by administrative costs, compliance requirements, and programs that don't demonstrably improve student outcomes? It's a question every taxpayer should be asking. Governor Shapiro, like many Democrats, seems to reflexively defend the status quo, likely out of fear of upsetting the powerful teachers' unions. He talked about partnering with them, and while collaboration can be beneficial, we also need to be honest about the potential for union interests to conflict with the best interests of students and parents. We saw this play out during the pandemic, with school closures dragging on far longer than necessary in many areas, often due to union pressure. What Bill Maher seems to be tapping into, and what resonates deeply with conservatives, is a frustration with the lack of accountability and the apparent stagnation in our education system. We're not afraid to ask the tough questions, to consider radical reforms, even the possibility of dismantling a failing system to build something better from the ground up. Shapiro, on the other hand, offered the standard political deflection, focusing on the good intentions behind the funding rather than the actual results. He mentioned setting education standards and studying curriculum. But where's the evidence that this centralized approach is working effectively across such a diverse country? What works in California might not work in Alabama, and vice versa. My take is this: the Department of Education has become a symbol of everything that's wrong with big government. It's a sprawling, expensive entity that hasn't delivered on its promises. We need to shift the focus back to local communities, empower parents with more choices in their children's education, and demand accountability from our schools. The fact that someone like Bill Maher, who comes from a very different political perspective, is raising these same concerns should be a wake-up call. It's not about partisan politics. It's about the future of our children. We need to have an honest conversation about whether the current system is serving them well. And if not, we need to be bold enough to make real changes, even if that means challenging the very existence of institutions like the Department of Education. What do you think? Let me know in the comments below. Are you as skeptical of the Department of Education as Bill Maher seems to be? Do you think Governor Shapiro offered a compelling defense of the status quo? Let's get the conversation going. And as always, if you appreciate this unfiltered, conservative perspective on the issues of the day, make sure to like this video, subscribe to the Black Coffee Podcast, and hit that notification bell so you don't miss our next deep dive. We'll be back soon with more hard-hitting analysis and honest opinions. Until then, keep brewing and keep thinking critically.